Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be here, and thank you, Ed, thanks to Gara for getting me involved in this. I'm sure you all have the experience of Gara getting you involved in things that got to be bigger and bigger as time went on. But I also find this absolutely fascinating discussion, working as I do as, as the lawyer for the people of the state of New York, but really seeing my work in the context of larger political trends. And I prefer to think of politics in the long term. And I gather that that's one of the questions that is being debated today. Now, the two people who just preceded me, Andrew has been hawking me for many, many years about how much we have to use technology and to do things. I barely understand a lot of what he says, but my daughter explains it to me, and then it makes perfect sense. And Jenna, I know from her work, and I was very proud to be involved with her changing the consciousness of people in New York State till we were able to pass the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. I remember you coming with your crew to my synagogue and getting them jazzed up. And what I want to talk about today is something that has been exemplified by both of these speakers. Not about technology or strategy, but really about how we frame up the choices that are before us if you want to take a serious look at philanthropy's role in changing public policy. I know that there are a lot of foundations that have spent many, many years providing services, seeking regulatory changes, and that there is now in the new world, not just of technology, but in post-Citizens United America, an important moment to step back and take a look at what we're doing and how we frame what we're doing, how we think about what we're doing. I respectfully submit that this can all be summed up, and I'll use everyone's favorite Supreme Court decision as an example, with the following assertion. Citizens United will go the way of Plessy v. Ferguson. It will be overturned. Its offensive ideas will be repudiated, but it is largely dependent on people like you to determine how long it will take for us to accomplish that. And what I mean is very simple. There are two essential ways to operate in politics. There are two essential ways to invest your money and resources in moving public policy. And I wrote an article a few years ago outlining this and have done some follow-up speeches about it. In my view, there are two kinds of work that I do in American politics: transactional political work and transformational political work. I have to do both. They're both part of my job. Transactional politics is pretty straightforward. What's the best deal I can get today on a health care bill or a gun safety bill or a drug reform bill? What do I have to do to elect someone who's an important ally of mine in the next election? Transactional politics is about being pragmatic about current realities, the state of public opinion today, and it's all about getting the best possible results in the circumstances here and now. Transformational politics is the work we do today to ensure that the deal we can get on health care or guns or immigration reform in a year or 5 years or 20 years is better than the deal we can get today. So transformational politics, and I consider both of the speakers who preceded me transformational political activists. It's about changing the way people conceive of issues and frame issues and opening people's minds to better possibilities about politics or economics or actually about human nature, and to move away from an old frame that prevents us from seeing and embracing policies that will make our lives better. Now, to be frank, I don't think this is a big secret. I approach public policy from the perspective of a progressive Democrat. But I always have to tip my hat to the conservative movement when I talk about transformational work, because the greatest transformational work that has been done in America over the last 30 years has been done by the far right. They have been unbelievably successful. During a period, one could argue that too many of our resources were spent on transactional politics. They've been very successful in seeing that there's an investment in changing people's fundamental assumptions for the long-term good, or bad, depending on your point of view. But the underlying assumptions about the role of government in the economy have been transformed by this movement. You think about it, they built an infrastructure of think tanks, media outlets, grassroots organizations, and professional societies, much of it funded by philanthropy. And I would argue that those investments in the transformational infrastructure of the contemporary conservative movement have had much more of an impact on the trajectory of American politics than all of their spending on either electoral campaigns or on campaigns to pass particular pieces of legislation over the last 30 to 40 years. The conservative movement sold Americans on the idea that government is less efficient than the private sector, that less regulation means more growth. They convinced millions of Americans of a magical free market in which most of the wealth naturally flows to a tiny portion of the population and that exists or would exist in the absence of government. And to me, most despicably, and this is something I spent many years of my life, an area I've spent many years of my life working on, I work on today. Over the last 30 or 40 years, they convinced millions of Americans of both parties that our own safety depends on the mass incarceration of millions of young African and American and Latino men. They did their job well. And I feel as though we're at a moment where some of us who see progress as leading in a different direction have to make some choices about whether we're going to continue to focus on the transactional or we're going to invest in more transformational work. There have been examples of progressive success over the last 30 years also. I want to, and people here have funded it, so I want to pay my respects to that. And certainly I think Ai-jen and Andrew are at the leads of advocacy for what it really is another form of transformational political movement. But successful transformational politics. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in the transactional work when we repealed New York's Rockefeller drug laws. We had the worst drug laws in the country. They were one of the first mandatory sentencing laws that were passed in the United States. And the transactional work that I did literally was to go door to door to others. I was in the state senate at the time, other state senators, because I only had a 1-vote edge, and I got 32 votes, and that's what I needed. And I had to edit the bill as I went from senator to senator to make sure I had the votes to pass. That was good transactional work. But it was only possible because the Open Society Institute and other foundations had invested so heavily in the transformational work that went on in the decades before that. And we reframed the notion of what mass incarceration of drug offenders was about. When I would talk in the years leading up to the repeal and travel around New York State, nobody I was talking to usually knew what the Rockefeller drug laws were. But because of the transformational work that had been done so amazingly by the network that was assembled and paid for through philanthropy, pretty much everyone, even like small town audiences upstate, they all knew they were bad. You know, saying we should repeal the Rockefeller drug laws. They were like, you know, we had draconian appended to the front of Rockefeller drug laws. You thought the first part of the phrase was draconian by the time we were done with the transformational work. And that's what enabled us to do the transactional work. We shifted public consciousness and got people to see nonviolent drug offenses not as a law enforcement problem, but as a public health problem. Similarly, I know a lot of people here have been involved in the efforts successful in New York recently to pass marriage equality laws. The transactional work in 2011 to get the votes together to force the leaders of the state Senate here to bring the marriage equality bill to the floor to get the votes to pass it. That was good transactional work. But it was only made possible by decades of transformational work to change public awareness about our LGBT brothers and sisters, and to change popular culture, which is a tremendously important part of transformational work. I mean, listening and telling stories doesn't have to be done in any sort of formal atmosphere. All we do all day is listen and tell stories. You have to, if we can get engaged in changing the way those stories are told, we're well on our way to transformational politics. So let me note that all of the great progressive movements in American history depended, at least in part, on philanthropy to get them going. And I want to bring this back to where I started. The Civil Rights Movement did not succeed when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Movement succeeded when all across our country, black and white Americans looked at each other and left behind the assumptions of the past and saw fellow human beings and fellow Americans. It was the transformation of consciousness that led to the transactional work that the politicians always rush in for. You know, politicians are always there to sign the bill once the transformational work has been done, and you know, it's easy to actually close the deal. I would note that philanthropists have always been at the beginning of significant movements, whether it's the women's suffrage movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and politicians are always there at the end. None of the transformational movements on the right or left that I've referred to here was ever started by an elected official. So for whatever it's worth, for those of you who are thinking about how heavily to weigh in on the election of myself or my colleagues, to me, there is a deeper level that we have to address if we're going to actually be able to engage in the transactional work you want us to engage in on many issues. So coming back to Citizens United and Plessy v. Ferguson, if we're going to overturn Citizens United, which I think we will, we have to understand the assumptions that lead people to think it's okay and it makes sense. And we have to dig deeper than that one Supreme Court opinion, because it's based on a notion that money equals speech, which comes from an earlier Supreme Court decision in a case called Buckley v. Vallejo. Now, to me, that is a fundamentally un-American, anti-democratic proposition. Money equals speech. A multi-billionaire has 10,000 times or 100,000 times the free speech rights of an ordinary citizen. I don't think that, when you think about it that way, I don't think it makes much sense. I don't think it's consistent with our Constitution. I don't think you can have equal justice under law or equal protections of the laws if you allow that to go forward. But frankly, after Buckley v. Vallejo in '76, there really was not much of a transformational response to try and root out that and challenge that basic assumption. And that's what underlies Citizens United and all the other bad decisions about money and politics that have come since then. And what we need is, I know there was some discussion earlier about whether or not people think that their foundation world is too timid or not, or whether, and it's as usual, everyone thinks they're doing great and that everyone else is too timid or something like that. This is common in polling in every group. But I would urge you that there is a special role for philanthropy in movement building and in transforming people's ideas about communication and the internet, transforming people's ideas about those who work to help us and aspire to live their lives alongside us with respect and dignity. The transformation of public awareness about domestic workers, or about how you use the internet, or about race or gender or sexual orientation is all about transformational work. And I would like to close by citing my favorite act of philanthropy in American modern political history, which took place in 1930. And this is kind of what I think some of us are looking for when we say less timidity is in order. And believe me, I give the same speech when I address the Democratic leadership of Congress, where less timidity is clearly in order. The American Fund for Public Service made a grant of $100,000 in 1930 to a small group of activists in the NAACP and Howard Law School, led by someone who's a role model for the lawyers in my office, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was then the dean of Howard Law School. And the $100,000 was given, and this is a quote, it was given to support, quote, a large-scale, widespread, dramatic campaign to give the Southern Negro his constitutional rights, his political and civil equality, and therewith a self-consciousness and self-respect which would inevitably tend to affect a revolution in the economic life of the country. Now that's what I call a transformational statement of philanthropy. And if we see more willingness to look for the long-term, now I have to point out, this was given in 1930. Houston, who didn't even live to see the conclusion of this, and his protege Thurgood Marshall and the others who brought this about, they didn't conclude their work until we were into the 1960s. Plessy was overturned in 1954. The Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964. Many of them knew they were dedicating themselves to a cause they would not live to see completed. But that's transformational political work, and whether we like it or not, if we're not doing it, someone else is. So I hope that as you consider how to do your work in the days and weeks and months ahead, you'll consider this. I'm all for trying to get the best deal we can get today. But if you're not working to change public consciousness so that we can get a better deal in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, the other side is. And when they meet you, they will beat you. Thank you.